Hello, and welcome back to The Canadians. I'm your host, Jared Michael. Here at The Canadians, we attempt to understand Canada's contrarians. We believe contrarians are sometimes the only people holding valuable information the rest of society desperately needs. Today's guest is Tara Henley. Tara is a veteran Canadian journalist, author, and the host of the independent current affairs podcast, Lean Out. She spent nearly a decade working as a producer and occasional on-air columnist at the CBC before resigning from the public broadcaster in 2022. Her essay explaining that decision and her concerns about the direction of the CBC and mainstream journalism more broadly brought her national attention. Her latest book is The Trust Spiral: Why the Media Needs Objectivity, an examination of the collapse of public trust in journalism, an argument for returning to some of the standards and practices that once defined the profession. We begin our conversation with Tara's diagnosis of what went wrong. We discuss the economic collapse of the traditional media business model, the rise of activist journalism, the changing culture inside newsrooms, and the decision by many journalists to move away from objectivity. The CBC runs throughout our conversation. As a lifelong CBC listener myself, I wanted to understand whether the institution can once again become a place where Canadians with very different political views can go for a shared set of facts. We also discuss some of the major stories Tara believes Canadian journalism needs to reckon with, the lack of political and intellectual diversity inside newsrooms, and whether rebuilding trust requires the media to acknowledge where it has gone wrong. Underlying our conversation is a larger question. In an increasingly fragmented and polarized country, is it still possible to create journalism that Canadians across the political spectrum can trust? Here's my conversation with Tara Henley. Tara Henley, welcome to The Canadians.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, you came upon my radar, I think, when you left the CBC. You didn't do it quietly. You wrote a great essay, kind of, and as a long time, I've been a lifelong CBC consumer. To this day, it's still the first place I go every morning to get my news. And so, it really resonated with me. And so I would love to have talked to you ever since I read that. But then you've really expanded that into this book, The Trust Spiral. And so where you've kind of diagnosed kind of a problem, what you see as a problem, and you've kind of put forth some solutions at this time, namely, let's say, you're kind of arguing for a return to the standards of objectivity. And so I thought we'd just have an hour here. I thought maybe we can kind of focus on those two pillars of your book, kind of the problem, the solution. And maybe if we have time later on, we can maybe push and pull at your argument a bit and see where it goes. But just maybe get the conversation going. What is the trust spiral? Why did you want to name your book that?
Yeah, so I guess in about 2023, I write for the Literary Review of Canada, and my editor there, the editor-in-chief, Kyle Wyatt, and I had lunch, and we were talking about trust in the media that I'm obviously very concerned about and have been thinking and talking about and interviewing on for quite some time. And Kyle was wondering if we could come up with a thesis for what was going on, and he assigned to me the 2024 Massey essay on the state of the media as a way of us investigating this question of trust and what has happened. And so we know that trust in the media is low. It's at record levels. It's low in a lot of Western countries, especially the United States and in Canada. But there's not a lot of comprehensive thinking on what has happened. And so what we've seen are media leadership basically externalizing the problem, blaming it on factors like social media, on things like attention fragmentation and news avoidance and bad actors online and even hostile politicians. All of those things may be contributing, but I felt like we really needed, as a profession, to have a look at what our role in this is. What is it that we are doing that is driving away people who previously trusted us? And so we worked with Kyle and his team at the Literary Review, and we produced a 10,000-word essay called The Trust Spiral. And then I was lucky enough to have a publisher in the UK see a book in it, and so we expanded it into book format. The basic thesis is that the very central problem is economics. We know that the media business model has collapsed. We know that the media is in a pretty weak and vulnerable state. And we can go into, this in more depth in the factors. But my contention is that this weakened state already existed when Donald Trump came on the scene in 2016, and that a state of exception was declared within the mainstream media. The arguments, and you can track them sort of op-ed by op-ed, conference by conference, is that Donald Trump was an extraordinary candidate and that we needed extraordinary measures to deal with him. And the argument became that we should throw out the playbook. This is in the words of Jim Rettenberg of the New York Times.
Mhm.
Basically, we needed different standards and practices for dealing with this moment. And unfortunately, guardrails exist for a reason. And when you throw out your guardrails, you don't get to control where that goes. And so my argument is this was not contained to just President Trump or to the Trump eras, that this bled into all of our coverage. And that we've had these kind of rolling panics. And that the problem mainly sits with the fact that when we are engaged in these kind of panics, when we have lost our standards and practices, we lose accuracy. And that I think that's what the public is most upset about, is the ideological bent and the lack of accuracy. And so that's just sort of a rough framework of what I'm arguing in the book. It is a thesis. It's very much up for discussion and debate. And I've been really heartened doing press for this, that I am getting interview requests from different parts of the political spectrum, which is my hope, is that this is nonpartisan and that we can argue it from both sides.
Right. Okay. And so that economic argument has been around for people old enough. We've kind of watched it happen, like with the invention of the internet and the collapse of the classified ads, and just slowly
Mhm.
over time, we've watched the advertising model collapse and all that. And so that's one of the pressures. And then it also seems the rise of citizen journalism, where you're having people who maybe don't have the same commitment to the same standards, being able to get things out quickly. Is that some of the pressure also? There's the economic side, but is there also the pressure to keep up with modern day citizen journalism?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there's the accelerated news cycle, which we saw even starting 20, 30 years ago, and it just keeps speeding up and speeding up. And now it's basically nonstop. So there's that. Digital speed is quite a speed to work at. But then, as you say, we do also have the rise of media influencers. And I'm of two minds on the media influencers. I think that it is healthy sometimes to have a fresh set of eyes on some of these stories, and people who are unaffiliated and outside of the mainstream media are not subject to the same groupthink that we are. And so I think that that's helpful. And I think that it's helpful sometimes to put pressure on the dominant narratives. However, I believe in accuracy and truth-based journalism. I think we need a shared set of facts. I don't think that we get that all the time from media influencers. And I think that we desperately need that. And we don't have that right now in this country. We don't have a shared set of facts on some big stories. And I would like you open with the CBC. I love the CBC. I also used to listen to the CBC radio hours a day. I worked there. I love that institution. I would love to see them play that role in this country of giving us a shared set of facts that are available to everyone, because it is free. It's taxpayer funded. And then we can debate that shared set of facts from all points on the political spectrum. But we need a basic body of reliable information for people to decide how they want to be governed.
Well, maybe we'll just give you an opportunity then to quickly define in your words, and like you're kind of making that shared set of facts. You're saying a return to kind of the standards of objectivity. Do you want to briefly just talk about what objectivity is when referring to the media?
Yeah, no, it's great to ask that, because I
Mm.
think there's a lot of confusion about what objectivity is. And so I'm using the term in its old sense of what it meant when it was originated within journalism. And so just to give your listeners a little bit of background on where it came from. In the 19th century, and I'm talking specifically about the United States because there's the best scholarship on the United States media environment, you had partisan outlets. You had outlets that were specifically funded by partisan parties and candidates. And so that was very much an agenda-based press. Then you have the rise of the penny papers. And so this was switching the funding model away from patrons towards subscriptions and advertising. And the penny papers moved away, they moved their sphere of focus to, I guess, what Columbia journalism professor Michael Schudson in his book says is like a more democratic approach to the news. And in that crop of penny papers, the New York Times basically set the standard, saying that they would cover the news without fear or favor. And this idea of objectivity is not about an individual journalist's outlook. It's not that I would pretend that I don't have biases or blind spots. It's about a method of approaching journalism. It is a collection of standards and practices. And when it originated, it was in a moment very much like ours, a lot of suspicion toward the press and a lot of cynicism in the public. So you had things like World War II, where you had really egregious reporting errors. And then you also had the rise of public relations and spin and the sort of trying to influence, the public's collective passions and the public becoming aware of that. And as well, you had philosophers at that time that were very cynical, and that was beginning to be more widely taught. So the evolution of objectivity is not a negation of our own subjectivity. It is an attempt to mitigate against it. It's these standards and practices that we employ to try to mitigate against our biases and our blind spots, and to the end goal being to produce news that is replicable and reliable in terms of its information. We know that it's an aspiration. It's not something we can ever achieve, but it's a North Star that we move toward. And as opposed to other approaches to the news, which we can talk about later, but it's an orientation and a specific set of standards and practices.
And so do you see it as essentially philosophically different from objectivity in science? Like this is a term that we need to separate from science, or do you see it as an overlap, that it's an extension of that form of objectivity?
I think at the time that it evolved, there was this fascination with the scientific method. And so it's very much influenced by that. And so if people are wondering what are some of these standards and practices, it's things like having multiple editors review a piece of writing, and so that you're not captive to one perspective. It's things like on contentious issues, interviewing a range of subjects, again, so that you're not captive to one perspective. It's things like writing the news without hyperbole, without snark. I mean, there's a great article on the history of objectivity by David Greenberg. And this is called The War on Objective Journalism. This article really goes into what those standards and practices are in detail and explains why they exist.
Yeah, I think you laid out in your book that kind of have like at different levels of like news collection, the way you write about it at different stages. There's just different
Yes.
method things you do. And so I guess those are the standards that largely got thrown out with Donald Trump, I guess, in a sense. And
Yeah, you could see it all happening. The New York Times is a great resource for all of this. You could see it all happening kind of day by day in that paper. It's things like, do we use the term lie? And there was the public editor of the New York Times wrote a piece on this at the time that it was all happening. And there was a taboo on using the word lie in newsrooms for many years, because it is not just a falsehood. It implies the intent to deceive, and that's quite difficult to prove. And also it is very weighted politically. It's very fraught, to use that term, and it can come across as quite partisan. And so the New York Times started using it in headlines about Donald Trump. And so it's those kind of like minutia things that make most of our eyes glaze over. But, little bit by little bit, it makes a huge difference on how the news is reported.
all right, well, maybe we'll look at objectivity from a couple different push at it here, if you don't mind. You said to discuss and debate here. And I know when your publicist sent the copy of your book, it triggered a memory in my mind of when you interviewed David Cayley on your show, your podcast. And I can remember because I had talked to David Cayley as well, and I didn't spend much time on his criticism of objectivity because I was largely in agreement with it. But I remember you got hung up there for a little while in your conversation with him, and I remembered thinking, oh, she's really pushing back on this one. And now I can see it's because you're probably going back and writing a book on how we need to. And so I remember I noticed in your memorial piece to David Cayley, you mentioned that you've had the opportunity to sit down with him at his
Mhm.
home this year a few times, and I can't help but think this topic did not come up. And so,
Mhm.
has it come up? And I'm curious to know if you could articulate what David Cayley's objections were and how you addressed them.
Yeah, so, oh, David Cayley, may he rest in peace. What a an absolute icon in this country, and I have enormous respect for him, and, was very, very sad at his passing. I think that he was coming from it from a very philosophical perspective. He's, of course, he was much more well-versed in philosophy than I am or ever will be, and I think his, resistance to the term objectivity is an idea that I hear very often from a number of other journalists that I respect, that we really can't ever fully be objective, that it's not possible, and that philosophically we have to recognize that and be transparent about where we're coming from. That's what I took him to mean in that conversation. And for me, I think for me, the biggest thing is just, again, getting back to these standards and practices, regardless of how we view objectivity, how we think about ourselves and our own orientation, do we adhere to these standards and practices? And there's another journalism professor in the United States, Dan Kennedy, and he recently reviewed my book. And he says, at the end, it doesn't really matter what we call it. The point is, are we giving fact-based journalism? Are we truth seeking? And I think that's the common ground between both of the sides in many instances, is that idea of truth seeking. And so I will tell you that the conversations that I had with David in his home, we actually didn't talk about objectivity to my to my recollection.
Uh,
Um, David was beginning to help me on my next book, which is about men and women and the break
uh,
between men and women. And so we spent a lot of time talking about that, and I'm very sad that that we won't get to continue that. Sorry, I'm getting choked
uh,
up that we won't get to
yeah,
continue
no,
that conversation.
yeah, no, he was a great man and great Canadian. It's sad to
Yes,
see him go.
yes.
Yeah. And yeah, I remember when talking to him too, that's exactly what he did say. I think he was looking at it pretty deep and philosophically in the sense that, like, especially with new media where you're actually in the center of it, he was, how
Mhm.
can you separate yourself from it? But he did talk about it's the virtues that, fairness of,
Mhm.
open-mindedness, those things can be, we need to carry those on one way or another. But there's
Mhm.
also, I guess, we can look at it from another angle. The journalism schools today,
Yes.
there seem to be a lot of them that are pushing back against objectivity from a different angle and a different way. And would you want, like, what is the state of journalism schools today and how modern journalists are produced?
Yeah, so I didn't go to journalism school, and I'm not in the school, so I wouldn't know exactly. I can tell you what I hear from participants in journalism school is that there is a real push against objectivity, and we see that reflected in the data around the trade press, around journalism press, things like Columbia Journalism Review and other outlets that focus specifically on journalism. We do see Quillette recently had a wonderful piece by a journalism professor, and he went into the data of how objectivity is covered in the trade press, and it was overwhelmingly negative. It was not balanced. It did not have a lot of people like me arguing in favor for it. And so I think you would see that reflected in journalism schools, and I certainly hear that from journalism students, but I don't have data on that, so I wouldn't want to go too far in that direction, having no direct experience with it.
But is there, from the outside completely, I often hear there's been a rise in what there is often called activist journalism, where there is like a very detachment where it's no overlap at all. There's
Mhm.
a belief that it's not about facts, it's about supporting the right moral argument, essentially. Do you see
Yes.
that? Is that over exaggerated or is that actually occurring in journalism?
I saw that in the newsrooms all the time. And I will say
Uh,
there's a lot of nuance to this conversation. There are some journalists who reject objectivity, but who still very much believe we need to adhere to standards and practices. I think the problem is, and the next generation of journalists, because going back to the economic model, we don't have the resources to do rigorous training for journalists anymore. And part of this comes from the consolidation of journalism in these big urban cities. We're losing a lot of local news. So we lose the farm team, essentially. We lose the ability for people to go all over the country to train in lower stakes settings and to really learn the nuts and bolts of journalism. How do you cover the courts? How do you cover the school board? That kind of thing. So I think the younger generation is missing out on a lot of that training and on a lot of that mentorship. The other thing is when you have mass layoffs and you have the collapse of newsroom hierarchy, you're going to lose a lot of that mentorship. You're going to lose the people who are showing the next generation why these nuts and bolts are so important. So I do think that there are some, and I certainly, this was my experience in the newsrooms, there are some in the next generation who use the objectivity argument as license to ignore some of these standards and practices and ignore the rigor of them. But not all people who are arguing against objectivity are arguing for that. But I do think there has been this sense of activism, of advocacy in the next generation, and that there is this sense that it is a moral endeavor, that we need to be out there promoting the right moral perspective. And I think there is this feeling that journalism is a way to influence public opinion. Whereas I think the older school, and certainly that I would adhere to, that it's not about influencing public opinion. It's about gathering all the available facts and perspectives and really having faith in the public. And having faith in democracy, that our job is really just to give the best available information we can get in that moment. Going back to, we know digital speed, we know all of these mitigating factors, but we try to give the best information we can. And then we trust the public to do with it what it will, to make its own decisions about what it means. And ultimately, how people want to vote, how they want to be governed.
It seems like, there's a lot of things coming together here, so many threads, so much nuance, like you say, but, just to whittle it down, it does seem like there's also these two factors. The one that you're really talking about a lot is economics, which you just can't ignore. But there also seems to be philosophy and philosophical arguments that are like, for instance, like I was looking at, the courts are kind of in Canada have also started to turn away from universalism and treating different people based on their identity differently. And I was looking for an image that reflected the blind justice, like kind of peeking up and looking, and because to me that is like, oh, we don't want that. But I found the image, and it was an award-winning piece of art a law student had made at a prestigious law school to show the future of law. That they're looking at this image and they're seeing that as a positive of what we need to do, and I'm looking at it going, I don't think that's a step in the right direction. So there seems to be a real moral, and David Cayley again spoke about that he's worried that we're disagreeing at the level of first principles and so do you see that on the philosophy side, that like that there is a question of like just on the basic fundamental moral level, all this stuff is being questioned?
I mean, I think the identity politics piece is a really, really important one that you've just raised. And it's something that I reject and that I saw a lot in the newsrooms, like a lot. In the book, I talk about where this, if we can call it the sort of great awakening, came from. I read a really amazing book by Musa Al-Gharbi, and it's called "We Have Never Been Woke." And then Musa came on my podcast, and one of the things he talks about with this great awakening, he says that it is a case of something, and if you look back over the last century, it has happened several times. And his argument is that it's essentially about elite overproduction, that you have this flood of college grads coming into the marketplace with expectations of an elite life and expectations of influence and prestige and a comfortable financial life. And that this is what's happening in the symbolic professions. He calls it symbolic capitalists, those of us who make a living by manipulating symbols, essentially. What happened is that we no longer have the jobs to sustain the number of graduates that we have. And so you've seen people get increasingly frustrated and full of rage at the system and the idea that we need to dismantle that system. But here's the key part, and replace the corrupt elites with people like us. And so that's the dynamic he's describing. And I think it makes a lot of sense, actually. The identity politics was very focused in particular directions. That there was a lot of focus on things like increasing minority representation in elite spaces, these kinds of things. It's not a working class movement. It is not a movement for, like, as Musa pointed out in his book, he was at Columbia. He had gone from selling shoes to now being a graduate school at Columbia. This was not a movement for the landscapers or the janitorial staff, or it's a very specific thing that we are seeing with this round of identity politics. And I do think there is a fundamental philosophical disagreement here. I agree with you. I would like to see equality under the law. And my argument is that once you start messing around with that, if you decide you're going to do it to benefit certain groups who may be very deserving of advantages after, the history that we have, the problem is that it's a Pandora's box and you don't get to choose where that goes. And you don't know who's going to be in power 10 years from now or 20 years from now. But the idea of a neutral rules in the law and in other areas of our society is an acknowledgement of that we need equality. Because we don't know where it goes otherwise. And of course we do know, because we've seen in history where that goes. And I just think it's playing with fire. I think it is absolutely playing with fire. And it's been very, very concerning for me. And to bring it back to journalism, and what does that mean on the ground? It means that when you are in a newsroom and you're doing stories that have a social justice thrust to them or concern, the rights or experience of minority groups who may be suffering, that you may, and I saw this, you may end up treating different subjects, interview subjects, differently and subjecting them to different levels of scrutiny. And the problem again with that is it assumes that we know where all of this is going to go, that it assumes so much more control and power on our parts than we actually have. And that sometimes you can end up bringing more harm by not scrutinizing than you can by just following the standards and practices you would with every other group. So one example of this, I think, is a really powerful one in this country, is the story of the graves, the mass grave that was discovered, and I'm sorry, I'm saying that in quotation marks, at Kamloops. And so we had the Kamloops band announce 5 years ago that they had confirmed the remains of 215 children, some as young as 3. This claim was not scrutinized, I would argue, for identity politics reasons. And the consequences are enormous. We had the flag lowered for 5 months, hundreds of millions of dollars in funding awarded. We had a real outpouring of grief and anger in this country. And we've now had the Globe and Mail editorial board, our paper of record, come out 5 years later and say this claim was not scrutinized. There is no evidence yet to confirm this. And I would argue, certainly from what I'm seeing online, that we are now seeing a real increase in prejudice against First Nations. And that is a tragedy. That is terrible. And so again, like, sometimes by not scrutinizing, you can have unintended consequences that you wouldn't anticipate. And the point is, we have to stick to neutral rules for all.
Okay. It's interesting. That is a big story that is breaking still, I think, in Canada after the Globe and Mail's editorial board kind of came back and walked that back. And so someone who has worked inside a CBC newsroom, I've noticed the CBC has not done the same thing yet. They have not, I don't even know if they've commented on the Globe and Mail's editorial board doing that. How is that decision made inside those rooms? Like, there must be a lot of pressure even within CBC to, and then I guess, like, and as part of this, is there a need at some point, if we want to establish trust again, does the media have to go back and reckon with the stories of the past, or can they just bring in new standards and just start doing better? Or is there having to go back? Because I got to say, as a reader reading your book, it felt really great to see even just a lot of those op-eds you're talking about from the New York Times, those discussions we knew about, just coming back again, because it felt like they just got forgotten. And so just seeing them get brought back up, that it felt like accountability. It felt like there is accountability happening. So to me, it feels like there does need to be a return or a reckoning with the media, but I'm not sure how you feel about that.
I agree. I agree with you completely. I think that on the big stories that we did not get right in the media, and I include myself in that, I did not get the grave story right initially either. Um, I think that it's not enough to issue corrections for those really big stories that have these massive consequences for the country and for reconciliation, which I think is a really important goal for us as a country. I think that it is not enough to just issue corrections. I will say that the CBC has issued some corrections. Notably, last year, Rosemary Barton on air said, yes, there have been remains found across the country. And the CBC immediately issued a correction saying, these are ground anomalies and making that clear. So I do think there needs to be some mea culpas made. I think that some of the big files in this country, I would argue the trucker convoy is another one that we in the media did not get right. During the pandemic, there's a number of files I think that we did a terrible job on. School closures is certainly one of them, a big deal in Ontario,
Yeah.
but really across the country. So I think that what is necessary is a sort of forensic analysis of what it is that we got wrong, why we got it wrong, and what we need to do in the future to ensure that we do not get these big stories wrong again. And I think that the national public broadcaster should be the one to do that. I think that
Hmm.
they should commit to a review of some of these big stories and take a look at where it went wrong. And, it can be, first of all, they have the resources to do it. But second of all, I still do see them as the leader in journalism in this country. And I think that it would be wonderful if they would take on that project. But it can be done in smaller ways as well. I mean, Persuasion, a liberal outlet in the United States, contacted me and asked me to do a piece on the grave story. And I spent 50, 60 hours. I built a timeline and I looked at exactly when and where and what was published and what were some of the turning points. For example, in July of 2021, not that long after the announcement from Kamloops, the Kamloops band held another press conference. And the ground penetrating radar specialist said at that time, look, we need to pull back a little bit and say that these are probable variables, that they are targets of interest, that you can't confirm based on ground penetrating radar alone, that you would always need to excavate to confirm. So there were these moments in that story where we could have looked at that and changed course. So I think, that's just a small way of doing that. That's a couple weeks work, but it chips away at this idea of sort of the vagueness of, we know we kind of got it wrong, but we're just going to move forward. We're not going to acknowledge much. We'll issue corrections here and there. No, we needed deep dives into these stories, because what I've learned, I mean, after I left the CBC, I started getting a ton of mail from the public. And I over the last 5 years, I've gotten a lot of mail from the public. And the idea that the public distrusts the media for vague or partisan reasons just doesn't fly with me, because I hear from people so often. And typically what I hear are incredibly specific reasons that the media is not trusted. Oftentimes people are citing specific facts in specific stories on a certain day. Like,
Hmm.
people, the public is not stupid. The public is very, very smart by and large. And in order to win back people's trust, I think we're going to have to come out and talk about these big stories and talk about specifically where we went wrong and why. And again, getting back to my thesis, I think a big part of this is the groupthink in newsrooms. And so many of us in newsrooms are urban and always have been. We are secular. We are highly educated. Most of us come from financially well-off backgrounds. This is a very actually unique set of people. Most of us are politically progressive. It's a very niche group of people. We really are. And given that we're no longer living anywhere except Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, we don't have a lot of contact with other places in the country. We don't have a lot of contact with other perspectives. We don't have a lot of contact with other classes. And this is really, I think, the crux of it. I really do think it's the crux of it. I do think we've done better in terms of increasing the racial diversification of our newsrooms, but right as that was happening, we are decreasing the diversification on all these other factors I've just spoken about. And I think it's something we're really, really going to have to address.
Yeah, I can see that. It is like, I want to look at this again from that moral argument side, and I want to get back to the economic side too. But
Mhm.
just going back, because you said you didn't have stats on the journalism school, but you did have stats in your book about what you're just talking about now. I think like weren't you getting out numbers about how
Yes.
small and of people believe these kind of more woke social justice ideas that get pushed into the media, but how time and time studies are showing the vast majority of the population, and it
Yes.
is this tiny, what you just described, that tiny demographic that is really there. And I think it's continuously around 5, 6% of the like it's a very small elite perspective that is being pushed out. But what I wanted to
Mhm.
get back to in a second is like you focused a lot on the Trump era and Trump, but you do acknowledge that the media was already kind of hobbling by the time Trump came along. And Donald Trump kind of woke me up to what was happening, and I have this opposition to these new ideas that you talk about too. Like I like equality, but I also it woke me up to the fact that I was in an echo chamber that regardless of these other ideas, like I go back now and look at my history of being a CBC consumer. And when you met another CBC consumer, you guys were kind of like kindred spirits. You're simpatico, like they have their CBC coffee mug, you have your CBC coffee. And
No,
one thing that meant was they weren't conservative.
no, they weren't.
Like
Yeah.
they weren't, and so going back even 30 years ago, and this is where the trust aspect, like,
Mhm.
the claim was we're objective, we're both sides. This is a one-stop shop where you can come and get fair, balanced news. I'm skeptical of that claim now, that is actually, I see maybe that this moral issue has been around since the 60s maybe, and it's just gotten bigger and bigger. And to the further away you get from the 60s, I think the more demonized conservatives become. And this is some reckoning, I think, as someone who I can't speak about what it's like to grow up on the right because I grew up on the left. But I do feel like there has to be a reckoning there too, where there's just a dismissal of conservatives. It's not quite like the best conservative politician is still not as up to the moral snuff as the worst, left of center politician. There's just something different about conservatives that, they're just
Yeah.
not. And so so I'm even before Trump, going back 30 years ago now, I'm not, can we have a one-stop shop or do you always have to read widely?
Well, now especially, I mean, again, getting back to what I hear from the public is that most people in the public feel like they have to read outlets on the left and outlets on the right, outlets in the center, and try to piece together what is going on, and that is a lot of work. It's a lot of burden to place on the
Yeah.
populace. People are
Mhm.
very busy. The cost of living is high. A lot of people are working multiple jobs. It's a lot to put on the public in terms of staying informed. Um, in terms of, yeah, there's so much to unpack on what you just said. First of all, I think that David Cayley's history of the CBC is a huge contribution to give us a sense of, beyond you and my lifespan, what has gone on with that institution and part of how it's ended up where it is today. Um, I think we do need to always remember there are many CBCs. That it's a huge, huge institution across the country, and there are many different parts of it. And I do think there's still good work being done there. I will say that I grew up on the very progressive left, and um, I certainly never worked with an open conservative at the CBC. And I think I am pretty much very widely considered to be on the right in those circles, except, I can tell you who doesn't think I'm conservative is actual conservatives.
Yeah.
So it's a very funny thing for me. But I will say I'm very curious about conservatives. And part of how I became so curious is just understanding when I was in the newsroom, particularly during the pandemic, of how much I didn't know and how much I didn't understand. And I don't think that there is a huge understanding of conservative Canada, let alone conservative America. That there are so many factions, that there are so many different streams of thought, and that there is actually quite a bit of common ground, really. When you get away from the far left and the far right, there's actually a lot of common ground in the center. And so I find it really interesting getting to interview across the political spectrum, and that's what I try to do on my podcast is I just find myself learning all the time, but also sometimes changing my mind about things. And in terms of the CBC, like, so how do you build an institution where it is a one-stop shop? And that is the magic question. I mean, who knows? It's very difficult to know how you would do that. But I wrote a piece, I guess maybe a year or two ago. I got invited to a conference of media and was asked to present on the CBC. So I wrote a piece about how you save the CBC, and I had 15 recommendations. And some of it was just as simple as I don't think that people in the newsroom have a lot of contact with alternate views on these big contentious issues of the day. So I was suggesting there should be mandatory lunch and learns, and you should bring in controversial figures on these big contentious issues of the day so that at least there's some contact with those other views. And I mean, a big example of that would be gender critical feminism, which is covered extensively in the UK and is starting to be covered a lot more in the United States, but is almost no coverage at all here. And yet these views, like, for example, the view that women's sports should be confined to those who are, biologically women, that is a very, very mainstream view.
Mhm.
And there's been quite a bit of polling on that. But you don't see people who hold that view represented hardly at all in mainstream coverage on those kinds of issues in this country. And so I do think that, it's a big, overwhelming question overall, but there are small things that could happen right away that would dramatically increase trust. And that is really just reflecting the range of viewpoints in the country is a way of reflecting reality. And so when you sit down at a dinner table and most people that you talk to say, for example, I would like trans people to live in dignity and respect. I would like them to have full rights under the law. I think that where there is a clash of rights, like in women's sports, that we should preserve women's sports for those who don't have the biological advantage of having been through a male puberty. This view is very common. If it's not reflected in the media, it is not reflecting reality as we know it as Canadians.
Yeah, no, that's yeah, I can see that. And I just want to get back to the economic stuff before we run out of time here too,
Yeah.
because there is a big argument that is what really put all the, I'd be curious to know what you think of the subsidies and one, but
Yeah.
how, there's the line, show me the incentive, I'll show you the outcome. And so if we
Mhm.
still have all these incentives pointing in one direction, how do we just bring back these standards? How do we push back against the incentives that have eroded all these things? Like how do we,
Yeah.
where's the check?
I mean, I think we do it one issue at a time, one story at a time in the newsrooms. And part of this is our newsroom leaders finding some backbone and pushing back against the younger, more activist bent in our newsrooms. I think that is just an inescapable conclusion, but we also have to recognize that we just went through several years of purges in the newsrooms. We saw this happen in all outlets across the United
Yeah.
States and in Canada. The most famous example in Canada would be the Wendy Mesley example, Jamil Javani as well. And so if you are in danger of losing your reputation and your livelihood, if you misstep in a story meeting, then everybody is going to be afraid and they're going to be timid and they are going to be overly cautious, and you're not going to have that pitting of bias against bias, those really rigorous debates in newsrooms. We need to try to find a way to move past that era. And my view is that our leadership failed us. They didn't stand up to that tide, and that they could start doing so, and that would make a big difference right away. I do think that that in the States, we have seen more of that. We have seen A.G. Salzberger, the publisher of the New York Times, push back against this stuff. We have seen Joe Kahn, the editor of the New York Times, push back against this. We have seen Marty Baron. We have seen some of these real giants in journalism do that, and I would like to see that happen in this country. But overall, I do think it is going to be a day-by-day, story-by-story process, which is actually less overwhelming because you chip away at the problem instead of chipping away at the solution, which is what we've been doing for years. You raise the subsidies. I'm against the subsidies. I draw a distinction between the CBC because I think there is a place for a national public broadcaster in this country. I think it's important. We are a very diverse, very geographically spread out country. I think we need something for national cohesion and that shared set of facts I was talking about earlier. I disagree with the subsidizing of private newsrooms. I think it is impossible to avoid the perception in the public that we are having our bills paid by the bodies that we are meant to hold to account. And I also think it is stifling innovation. So someone like myself, who is an independent podcaster, I have had a very successful run in some ways, and in other ways, it is not thriving financially and it is incredibly difficult to scale. And
Right.
so we need to be able to create a marketplace in which innovation is valued and which we can start to experiment with new business models because, again, back to the economics, I do believe that the economics are the fundamental problem that we are grappling with. So I think the subsidies are perverting the landscape for us and losing us trust. And I would like to see them ended.
Haven't we actually had a case where a female National Post journalist asked a difficult question to a minister and they actually said, like, you should think about who's buttering your bread or something like that?
Yes, this was Terry Newman at the National Post, and I believe that it was a tweet exchange, and it was Talib Noor Mohammed, the liberal, who, again, paraphrasing, it was something like what you just said, and just the optics of that are terrible.
Well, because if it's being spoken aloud, you got to wonder. Yeah, it's terrible.
It's terrible.
And so just piecing back to the conversation we had just a moment ago about, how to get the newsrooms and then the economic you talked about how successful representation has come into the media, maybe not intellectual diversity, but is there not a solution of just getting a bunch of conservatives into these newsrooms?
Yeah, I don't know how. I mean, certainly there should be more ideological diversity. I just don't know the mechanism in which you do that, which is fair and still values the meritocracy, which I think is important. I don't know how you go about that. But what I do know is there could be more tolerance of other views in those newsrooms, that there could be. I mean, I never heard that we should have a diversity of viewpoint. That was not something that was spoken in my newsroom.
Yeah.
I never heard, but that's not true. I rarely heard, what is the conservative viewpoint on this? What conservative voice can we have? That was much less of a concern, specifically in the later time that I was at the CBC. So I think we have to recognize that conservatives are, 37% of the electorate, something like that, and that there needs to be, and this is something you could do institutionally, is say, we want more people focused on conservative politics. We want more conservative viewpoints on air. We want to include more of the debates within conservatism in our country, in our coverage. All of that could be done. It just requires a different orientation, a different set of priorities.
Yeah, and so why not just straight up hire, a Tristan Hopper or an Adam Zivo or an Amy Ham, and have them write for the CBC?
Yeah,
would
I mean,
that
you
help?
could, as long as you're not saying being conservative is a condition of your employment, right? Like that.
Well, but didn't we do that for all the other representation that got
We
brought into
did,
the
and
newsroom?
I disagreed with it
Oh yeah,
then.
I see. But for a newsroom though, wouldn't that be merit because you're bringing a very needed perspective, and so wouldn't that be a merit argument?
Yeah,
Like you'd have to be a good journalist and you'd have to have the standards still, but you part of the merit would be that you're bringing a much needed voice into the newsroom.
100%. Like, and I have argued that in the past myself, but I'm a little wary. I just think it's a slippery slope. Like, I think you just have to be really careful once you get into these alternate. You know what I mean?
Yeah. You're sticking to you don't want partisan, right? You're saying you'd still prefer someone to try to be fair, be
I would
balanced.
rather we take a holistic approach and say we need a range of viewpoints. We're going to have to go out and find
Yes.
them.
That's where CBC could excel at that. Like they could
and why
really
couldn't
excel.
they? They have
Yeah.
tons of talent, tons of resources. Why couldn't they?
Yeah, it is their mission statement essentially to do just that.
100%. And they have a track record of inclusion in other areas. I mean, they can They can figure it out. I'm sure they can figure it out.
But going back to that argument I made, we're realizing that maybe even 30 years ago, CBC was a little biased still way before Trump, it's,
Mhm.
yeah, I'm just wondering if there's oh, I won't go down that angle, but well, this is what I was going to say. One thing I appreciate about conservative media is it calls itself conservative media.
Mhm.
Whereas I turn on CTV News right now, Global News, CBC News, and they're acting like The Guardian, BBC. They act like they're balanced, both sidism. When I feel like maybe it'd be more honest at this point to just say we're liberal media,
Mhm.
and at least that way, like we don't have this disconnect where conservatives are being honest that their media is conservatives and it's biased. Whereas you still have this other people that are pretending where, as you
Mhm.
say, they're reflecting this 5% elite viewpoint while claiming to represent the entire country. And so there's this inherent dishonesty there where I'd be much
Yeah.
more comfortable until we get to where you're talking about, where we get back to the standards.
Yeah.
I almost would be more comfortable if they just called themselves liberal media.
Yeah, I hear this argument all the time. And the numbers in the States, I think it's like about 6, 7% that are progressives. It would be higher in our country because our country is more of a progressive country in general. But I know what you're saying. I think that the idea is fair enough. However, what does it look like in practice? And the problem, and I have this problem with conservative outlets as well. The problem is if you're going to say that you are a ideologically oriented outlet, then you're conceding that you are choosing things based on considerations other than what is newsworthy and what is factually accurate and what is truth seeking. And
Hmm.
to me, you're giving up the game. Then
Yeah, yeah.
you're giving it all up. Like why? That's fine for opinion pieces, opinion journalism. If people want to build arguments, they're going to leave out some facts and include others to make their strongest point they can. Fine. That's opinion journalism. But that is not what we need in truth seeking news. This is not going to help our public decide how it wants to be governed. And in fact, you're seeing so much chaos and confusion and polarization right now. I think it just adds to all of that. And so I don't like it on the left, but I don't like it on the right. I will like at least some outlets to be dedicated to truth seeking above all else.
Yeah, I'm with you on that then. Yeah. Okay, well, we'll be respectfully of your time here. Is there anywhere you want to point people to for your book, for you to hear about more of your thoughts? Anything you'd like to leave people with?
Yeah, so people can find my book, The Trust Spiral: Why the Media Needs Objectivity, in stores now. And you can listen to my podcast, Lean Out, on all podcast providers. And if you want to check out my newsletter, it is tarahenley.substack.com. And feel free to reach out. I really like hearing from the public. I like hearing what's on your mind. And I can't respond to every email, but I certainly read them all and think about them. And it helps me a lot in trying to understand where we are at this moment as a country.
Oh, well, thank you, Tara, for all the work you do for the book. It's a huge contribution, a lot of work that you put into it, and it's very readable. It's a very approachable book, and so I highly recommend it. And yeah, and thank you for taking the time to come on the Canadians today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for a great conversation.
All right, well, we'll say goodbye to everybody. Bye, everybody. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to support the show, please visit our donations page or subscribe and share with friends. The Canadians, working class roots, a free speech lens, Canadian contrarians.